It was a cold, windy night, the kind that bites at your skin and seeps into your bones, making you feel like the chill might never leave. The city was cloaked in a thick blanket of silence, interrupted only by the occasional rustling of dry leaves caught in the wind or the distant hum of a car passing by. The streets, usually bustling with life, now seemed eerily deserted. Streetlights flickered, casting ominous shadows on the cracked pavement below. Under one such flickering light, near an old, forgotten alley, lay a small, tattered bundle. A child. He was wrapped in a threadbare blanket, his tiny body curled up as if trying to make himself disappear from the harshness of the world. But he didn't cry out. His silent suffering, though heartbreaking, was all he knew. The cold had long taken away his tears, leaving only the quiet resolve of someone who had already seen too much. As the night deepened, the boy remained there, alone and forgotten by the world. Who could have left him here in this state? And why? These were the questions that would haunt anyone who passed by, but on this night it seemed no one would. But fate has a way of intervening when we least expect it. Unbeknownst to the boy, his life was about to change forever. Miles away, in a grand mansion on the other side of town, the Larsons were wrapping up their evening. The Larsons were known far and wide for their wealth and influence. Their home, a sprawling estate with perfectly manicured lawns and towering gates, was the epitome of luxury. Mr. Larson, a successful entrepreneur, and his wife, a philanthropist with a heart of gold, had everything one could ever desire, except for a child to share it with. For years, the Larsons had longed for a child. They had tried everything, doctors, treatments, even considered adoption, but nothing had worked. The emptiness in their lives was a wound that no amount of wealth could heal. They threw themselves into their work and their charitable endeavors, but the void remained. That night, Mr. Larson was driving home from a late meeting, his mind filled with thoughts of yet another fruitless discussion with adoption agencies. The roads were dark, and the weather was turning colder by the minute. As he drove through the quieter streets on the outskirts of the city, something caught his eye. There, on the sidewalk, under the dim light of a flickering street lamp, was the bundle. At first, Mr. Larson thought it was just a pile of old clothes someone had discarded, but something urged him to slow down, to take a closer look. As he did, his heart skipped a beat. There was movement. He quickly pulled over, his heart pounding in his chest, and rushed over to the bundle. To his shock, he found a small boy, barely covered by the thin blanket, shivering in the cold. The child looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too knowing for someone so young. He was silent, but his gaze spoke volumes. Without a second thought, Mr. Larson scooped the boy up in his arms, wrapping him in his coat to shield him from the biting wind. He hurried back to his car, cradling the child gently as if afraid he might break. As he drove home, Mr. Larson's mind raced. Who would abandon a child like this? What could have happened to lead to such a tragic situation? He knew he should call the authorities, but something held him back. There was something about this child, something that stirred emotions he hadn't felt in years. What if this child was meant to be theirs? Could this be the miracle the Larsons had been praying for? When Mr. Larson arrived home, his wife was waiting for him, worried as always when he was late. But when she saw him walk through the door with a small child in his arms, her worry turned to shock. "Henry, who is this?" Mrs. Larson's voice was filled with concern as she rushed to her husband's side. "I found him, Mary," Mr. Larson replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He was just lying there, all alone. Mrs. Larson looked down at the boy, her heart breaking at the sight of him. His clothes were dirty, his face pale, and his body so small, so fragile. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something that took her breath away. There was a depth in those eyes, a sense of wisdom and pain that no child should ever have to bear. Without a word, she reached out and gently touched the boy's cheek, her maternal instincts taking over. The boy flinched at first, but then relaxed into her touch, as if sensing the kindness in her heart. The Larsons quickly set to work, making sure the boy was warm and safe. They bathed him, dressed him in soft, clean clothes, and fed him a warm meal. The boy ate in silence, his eyes darting around the room, taking in the luxurious surroundings. He seemed wary, as if unsure if this was all real or just a dream he would soon wake from. Over the next few days, the Larsons did everything they could to make the boy comfortable. They bought him toys, set up a room just for him, and even consulted doctors to ensure he was healthy. They named him Daniel, a strong name for a boy who had already shown incredible resilience. But, despite their best efforts, Daniel remained quiet, almost distant. He would play with the toys they gave him, but never with the enthusiasm one would expect from a child. He seemed to be waiting for something, as if he knew this life was too good to be true. Then, one night, as Mrs. Larson was tucking him into bed, Daniel finally spoke. "I remember everything," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Mrs. Larson froze, unsure of what he meant. She gently prodded him, asking him to explain, but Daniel simply shook his head and closed his eyes, as if to shut out the world. What could a child so young possibly remember that would weigh so heavily on his heart? The days passed, and Daniel's words haunted Mrs. Larson. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this child than met the eye. She confided in her husband, who shared her concerns. Together, they decided to seek help from professionals, therapists, psychologists, anyone who could help them understand what Daniel had gone through. But Daniel remained an enigma. He was polite, well-mannered, and quiet. He never threw tantrums, never cried, never asked for anything. It was as if he had learned to suppress his emotions, to hide his true self from the world. One evening, as the Larsons were sitting in their living room, Daniel walked in holding a small, worn-out photograph in his hand. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were filled with a mix of confusion and sadness. "Who are they?" Daniel asked, holding up the photograph. The Larsons took the photo and examined it closely. It was old and faded, but they could make out a young couple holding a baby, Daniel. There was something familiar about the couple, something that tugged at the edges of their memory. Mrs. Larson's heart raced as she realized who the couple was. The Winthrops, their closest friends who had perished in a tragic fire 5 years ago. The fire had consumed everything, leaving nothing but ashes and the memory of a happy family. The authorities had claimed there were no survivors, but now, standing before them was Daniel, the child they thought had died that night. The Larsons were at a loss for words. How could this be possible? How had Daniel survived? And why had he been abandoned on the streets instead of being cared for by family or friends? They decided to investigate, hiring private detectives to uncover the truth. The more they dug, the more they realized how interconnected their lives had been. The Winthrops had been more than just friends. They were practically family. They had shared holidays, vacations, and countless memories together. The loss of the Winthrops had left a void in the Larsons' lives, one they had never truly filled. But now, standing before them, was a piece of that lost family, a child who had somehow survived the tragedy that had claimed his parents' lives. What dark secrets would the Larsons uncover as they delved into Daniel's past? And how would these revelations change their lives forever? As the investigation continued, the detectives uncovered a series of events that were both tragic and shocking. The Winthrop family had been targeted, not by random misfortune, but by a calculated act of arson. The fire that had consumed their home was no accident. It had been set intentionally, by someone who wanted the family gone. But why? And who would want to harm such a loving family? The answers began to emerge slowly, piece by piece. The Winthrops had been involved in a legal battle with a powerful corporation, one that had threatened their livelihood and their reputation. The legal battle was fierce, and the Winthrops had refused to back down even when threatened. They had been on the verge of exposing a major scandal, one that could have brought down the corporation and its powerful allies. But before they could take their findings to the authorities, their house went up in flames. The detectives pieced together that Daniel's survival was no accident. Someone had taken him from the house before it was set ablaze, possibly with the intention of using him as leverage against the Winthrops. But when the fire consumed everything, those plans fell apart and Daniel was left abandoned, his fate forgotten by those who had orchestrated the tragedy. The Larsons were devastated by the revelations. Their hearts broke for the child who had lost everything and had been used as a pawn in a dangerous game. But they were also determined to protect Daniel, to give him the life he deserved, away from the shadows of the past. How could the Larsons protect Daniel from those who had already taken everything from him? And what would happen if those responsible realized Daniel was still alive? As the Larsons wrestled with the truth, they faced an impossible decision. Should they reveal Daniel's true identity to the world, knowing it could put him in danger? Or should they keep his past a secret, allowing him to live a normal life, free from the ghosts that haunted him? They knew that if they kept the secret, they would be living a lie, one that could unravel at any moment. But they also knew that exposing Daniel's past could bring the people who had harmed his family back into his life. The tension in the Larson household was palpable. Every day, they felt the weight of their decision bearing down on them. They watched Daniel closely, seeing the pain and confusion in his eyes as he struggled to understand his place in the world. Finally, the Larsons made a decision. They would tell Daniel the truth, but in a way that he could understand and process. They would stand by him, no matter what, and protect him from the dangers of his past. And they would continue to investigate, to find those responsible for the Winthrops' deaths and bring them to justice. But before they could act, something unexpected happened. One evening, as Daniel was playing in the garden, a stranger appeared at the gate. He was an older man, his face weathered by time and sorrow. He carried a small, worn suitcase and a look of determination in his eyes. The Larsons watched as the man approached Daniel, kneeling down to speak to him. There was a moment of hesitation, a pause that seemed to stretch on forever, before the man opened his suitcase and pulled out a small, tattered toy, a toy that Daniel immediately recognized. The boy's eyes lit up, and for the first time since he had come to live with the Larsons, he smiled. It was a smile of recognition, of connection, of finally finding something familiar in a world that had been turned upside down. The Larsons rushed to Daniel's side, their hearts pounding with fear and uncertainty. But as they reached him, the older man stood up, tears streaming down his face. "I've been looking for him," the man said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I've been looking for him for so long." The Larsons were speechless. Who was this man? And what did he want with Daniel? Who is this mysterious stranger? And what connection does he have to Daniel's past? The man introduced himself as Robert Winthrop, Daniel's grandfather. He had survived the fire, though barely, and had spent the last 5 years searching for his grandson. The authorities had told him that there were no survivors, but he had never given up hope. He had traveled from city to city, following every lead, every rumor, until he finally found the Larsons. The Larsons were shocked. They had known the Winthrops well, but they had never met Robert, who had been estranged from his son for years. The older man explained that he had been living abroad, disconnected from the family, but when he heard about the fire, he returned to find that his son, daughter-in-law, and grandson were gone. Robert had been relentless in his search, using every resource at his disposal. He had uncovered the truth about the fire, the corporation, and the people who had orchestrated the tragedy. But he had kept his distance from the Larsons, fearing that his presence might put them in danger as well. Now, standing in the Larsons' garden, Robert realized that he had found not just his grandson, but a family who had given Daniel the love and care he so desperately needed. The Larsons invited Robert into their home, where they sat down and discussed everything. The older man shared stories of the Winthrop family, stories that filled in the gaps of Daniel's past. He spoke of the love and joy that had once filled their home, and the tragedy that had taken it all away. Daniel listened intently, his young mind absorbing every word. For the first time, he began to understand who he was and where he came from. But he also realized something else, that the Larsons had become his family too. They had saved him, loved him, and given him a home when he had nothing. Could Daniel reconcile his past with his present? And what would become of his relationship with the Larsons and his newfound grandfather? With Robert's help, the Larsons intensified their investigation into the fire and the people behind it. They uncovered a web of corruption and deceit that reached the highest levels of the corporation. The arson had been orchestrated to silence the Winthrops, to prevent them from exposing a scandal that could have brought down powerful figures. The Larsons and Robert knew they had to act quickly. They couldn't allow these people to go unpunished, but they also knew that their actions could put Daniel at risk. They decided to go public, to bring the truth to light in a way that would ensure their safety. They worked with investigative journalists, providing them with the evidence they had gathered. The story broke in the media, sending shockwaves through the city. The public was outraged, and the authorities were forced to act. Arrests were made, and the people responsible for the Winthrops' deaths were finally brought to justice. But the victory was bittersweet. While the Larsons and Robert had succeeded in their quest for justice, they knew that nothing could bring back the family that had been lost. They could only hope that, by exposing the truth, they had prevented such a tragedy from happening again. As the dust settled, Daniel found himself at a crossroads. He had learned so much about his past, about the family he had lost, and the people who had tried to protect him. But he had also found a new family in the Larsons, who had given him everything they had. What would Daniel choose? His past or his future? And how would the Larsons and Robert support him in the decision he was about to make? In the weeks that followed, the Larsons, Daniel, and Robert grew closer as a family. They spent their days sharing stories, visiting the places that held memories of the Winthrop family, and creating new memories together. Robert decided to stay with the Larsons, to be a part of Daniel's life and help him navigate the challenges that lay ahead. But there was still one final decision to be made. The Larsons had been planning to formally adopt Daniel, to make him their son in every legal sense. But now, with Robert in the picture, they weren't sure what the right thing to do was. Should they continue with the adoption, or should they allow Robert to take over as Daniel's guardian? They sat down with Daniel, explaining the situation to him in the simplest terms. They told him that they loved him more than anything, and that they would support whatever decision he made. They assured him that no matter what, they would always be his family. Daniel thought long and hard, his young mind wrestling with the complexities of the situation. He loved the Larsons and the life they had given him, but he also felt a deep connection to his grandfather and the family he had lost. Finally, Daniel made his decision. He wanted to stay with the Larsons, the people who had saved him and given him a home when he had nothing. But he also wanted Robert to be a part of his life, to be his grandfather in every sense of the word. The Larsons and Robert were overjoyed. They agreed to move forward as a united family, with Daniel at the center of their love and care. The adoption went through, with Robert's blessing, and Daniel officially became a Larson. Could a family so torn apart by tragedy ever truly heal? Or would the scars of the past linger, affecting their future? As the years passed, Daniel grew into a confident, kind, and intelligent young man. He excelled in school, made friends easily, and showed a natural talent for leadership. But he never forgot the lessons of his past. He knew that life could change in an instant, that the people you love can be taken from you, and that you must always cherish the time you have with them. The Larsons continued their philanthropic work, but now with a new focus, helping families in need, particularly children. The Larsons continued their philanthropic work, but now with a new focus, helping families in need, particularly children who, like Daniel, had been through unimaginable hardship. They set up a foundation in honor of the Winthrops, dedicated to providing support and resources to children who had lost their families, ensuring that no child would have to face the world alone. Robert, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. He became actively involved in the foundation, using his experience and connections to expand its reach. He traveled across the country, speaking at events, raising awareness, and ensuring that the story of his family's tragedy and Daniel's miraculous survival would serve as a beacon of hope for others. As Daniel grew older, he became more involved in the foundation. He shared his story, not as a victim, but as a survivor who had found a new family in the most unexpected of places. His story resonated with people everywhere, inspiring them to support the Foundation's mission and to never lose hope, no matter how dire their circumstances. The Larsons, Robert, and Daniel became a symbol of resilience, love, and the power of family. Together, they faced their past, embraced their present, and looked forward to a future filled with hope and purpose. In time, Daniel graduated from high school with honors and went on to college where he studied law, driven by a desire to fight for justice and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He knew that his life had been shaped by tragedy, but he also knew that he had been given a second chance, one that he would not waste. The story of Daniel's journey from an abandoned child to a beloved son, grandson, and advocate for children's rights became one of legend. It was a story that people would tell for generations, a story of loss and love, tragedy and triumph, despair and hope. And at the heart of it all was the simple truth that family is not just about blood, but about the people who choose to stand by you no matter what. As the years went by, the Larsons Foundation grew, reaching thousands of children and families in need. Daniel, now a successful lawyer, continued to work tirelessly to ensure that the legacy of his past would make a difference in the lives of others. He knew that he was lucky to have found a family who loved him unconditionally, and he was determined to give that same chance to as many children as possible. The story of the boy who was found under a flickering street lamp on a cold night, who had lost everything but found a new family, became a symbol of hope and resilience. It was a story that reminded people of the incredible strength of the human spirit and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. And so, the story of Daniel and the Larsons lived on, a testament to the idea that no matter where you come from or what you've been through, there is always hope for a brighter tomorrow. And in that hope, we find the strength to keep going, to keep fighting, and to keep believing that the best is yet to come. What would you do if fate placed an abandoned child in your path? Could you open your heart and home to a child with a mysterious past? This is the story of the Larsons, a family who chose love above all else.